Alright, so today I'm going to be doing a sandbag video using the black Keda Wood Dye powder as the wash coat and going over the top of that with the blue Keda Wood Dye. I'm going to be using both powder dyes on this application, so it is a stronger concentrate. I went with a 1/2 teaspoon of the Keda Dye blue mixed to 4 ounces of rubbing alcohol. Here is just a demonstration of the final piece. This is the actual piece. The other piece has a little more figuring, so that's why I ended up showing that, just because that one piece didn't have quite as much figuring as I thought it would. So another question I ended up getting asked quite a bit is my wood preparation. So this video is going to cover some of that as well. Here I'm basically just running the long board of the curly maple through my surface planer. Cleaning up the wood. Don't worry, the video gets a little better. This is just video taken off of my iPhone. So here I'm actually showing and demonstrating some of the different wood specific sandpapers that I'm going to be going with. There's the 150, a 180, 120 I believe was the one that was on the sander at this time. I don't think I actually got a video image of that. And there's the 220 fine grit, because I'm going to be raising the grain on this particular operation and then sanding that back as well. So here I'm going over the board with a 120 grit, the wood specific sandpaper. This section here I just slowed down the fast time to show how fast I'm actually moving with that sander, because it's kind of deceptive when you end up doing a fast time. To get a good clean sand, you kind of have to let the sander move at a little slower rate. You just get a better sanding, and you're kind of letting the sandpaper do the work for you. You know, just kind of like a saw. Similar principles with that. Here I'm actually just looking over to make sure I have all the deep scratches. Sometimes with my knives on that, with my surface planer, I end up getting some curls that rip out if my blades aren't really sharp, so I'm just kind of giving it an overlook. Here again is with the 120 going over the edges. And then I end up progressing through the sanding. I end up going with the 120 to the 180, and here I'm just demonstrating going, I also go side to side over the curls and the figuring, just to try to get a little cleaner sand out. Oh, here I switched over. It'd be with the 150 grit after the 120 grit, and it's just a progression sand. I flip the board over and kind of repeat the process. Now here I ended up going with the 180. That was a 180 grit. And now after I was done sanding with the 180, this is warm water. So I took warm water and I just rub it over the surface. I'm also, as I'm doing this, the figure shows very well when you end up getting it wet like this. So on top of raising the grain, here I ended up finding a defect, so I'm just marking that for the 220 grit sand when I go into that process. And here's the 220 grit. So after that's dried, the fibers are sticking up nice. With a good clean sandpaper, you can end up getting a good clean cut. It ends up just giving a better overall sand. I do that even when I'm using the wood dye liquids. It just helps to get a good clean sand by raising the grain. It's not something that you necessarily need to do, but it's just a little extra effort that I ended up doing to end up just getting a cleaner sand. This is the Keda Dye kit. I'm just adding 2 ounces of hot water to the measuring cup, pouring that into my mixing jar, taking 1/4 teaspoon of the black Keda Dye, black wood dye powder, and mixing it in here pretty good. Now that's a pretty heavy concentration, 1/4 teaspoon to 2 ounces. That's actually very heavy, but I decided for the purposes of this video and using the wood dyes, I wanted to end up making a fairly concentrated version, so that way it will show up a little bit better on camera. Here I'm going with a 1/2 cup or 4 ounces of the rubbing alcohol. That was a 70% isopropyl rubbing alcohol. adding that to my mixing jar. And then here is 1/2 teaspoon of the blue wood dye powder for the Keda dye kit. So it's 1/2 teaspoon of the blue wood dye to 4 ounces of the rubbing alcohol. Again, that's a very concentrated batch, so it's going to be a little bit darker than the royal blue color. It'll be closer to more like a sapphire blue, a little bit darker of the royal blue color. So I've let this rest now for about 20 minutes, and I'm going to be applying this water-based black dye onto the surface of this wood. Now the reason I chose the water base is because it doesn't penetrate quite as far, which makes it a little bit easier to sand back. It also is a good preparation for the blue, or my next coat, because I did raise the grain already, but even with this, by using the water seems to leave a more bold color over the surfacing, just a more saturated color. So that's what I was looking for highlighting these curls, and that was the reason why I ended up kind of choosing the water-based version of the black dye. Now I went with some excess, I applied it, I let it sit, and then I just took my applicator, my cloth, my rag, and I just kind of checked it with that spot to see if it was looking fairly decent, and it turned out okay. So it looks like here I ended up getting both sides, even though I was just applying it to the one side. And I'm just wiping off the excess here. I'm going around it to make sure that I have coverage all the way around. I let this sit now for about 30 minutes. I let it completely dry out, and I'm going over it now with a secondary coat. I just went a little faster video time on there, so you guys don't have to sit and watch all that again, but it's basically the same process that I did on the first one, just as a second coat. Now the second coat allows a little more dye to be saturated into the wood fiber, and I wanted to kind of really highlight and pop that curl. Not necessarily having a very deep penetration, but just a good highlight. So here I'm taking a 220 grit. Actually, I'm showing here what it looks like as it's dried out. As you can see, it kind of has like a very deep charcoal look to it. Here I'm just preparing the 220 grit sandpaper, and I'll be removing the excess surface dye that is on the surface, because I just want to again highlight the curls and the figuring that's in the wood. Now you don't have to go all the way back to bare fresh wood, and I hope that that's one of these things that I can end up demonstrating in this video, that you can remove a good section and a good amount of the surface dye and then go into applying the blue dye over the top of that. So here I'm working on the sides again with the 220, and what I'm looking for here is just that there's going to be a clear area for the blue dyes to be able to go over the top of this black dye. So after I've done that initial sand back, I just really wanted to highlight and pop that grain even more. So here I ended up going over it again. Now it looks kind of deceptive in this video, but all I'm really doing here is I'm wetting it out. I'm not putting a whole lot of excess, but I'm just trying to make it even. As you can see here, I'm just evening it out. I'm wetting it, but not to the excess where there's a puddling that's on the wood surface. I'm just going over it with the dampened rag to make sure that it was wet out very well. Here I'm taking my dual action orbital sander with a 150 grit. again, that's wood specific sandpaper. I'm turning my speed down because my particular one has a variable speed, and I believe I turned it down to a 2. I know it didn't show up very well, but I turned it down to a lower setting just so I had a little more control. And I'm fast forwarding this now in a little faster time. So as I'm doing this, I'm actually looking at the curls to see how well the dye was situated in the curls. And again, I'm just removing that surface dye, and I'm trying to get to the new fresh wood that's underneath it without going too deep to pull off everything. So here I ended up moving my dual action sander up another 2 notches, so it went up to the 4. And I'm just removing the dye to get to a little cleaner process for the excuse me, for the wood surface. So I end up removing the 150 grit, and I know you're not supposed to go more than 2 sanding grits. So I ended up skipping the 180 and I went to the 220. I just didn't feel that this particular piece needed the 180. And it's right about in here where I kind of noticed that this piece didn't have quite as much figure that I really wanted it to have for a video like this. So I just started to hand sand this out a little bit more to try, and also while I'm doing this to kind of inspect the piece as well, try to see which side is going to be more presentable for giving a good demonstration for this particular type of video. And then I switched over here to the 400 grit just for the end grains now. So I used the 400 grit just on the end grain. Here I'm going over it with the blue. I did let this sit the entire time, so I made up the blue. So this is sat for this entire process. So it's been, I would say it's been sitting and resting for probably approximately an hour. Now this first one, I'm just kind of going over it. I'm not trying to disturb the black very much. That's why I ended up going kind of light over the first initial coating, just to wet it out, just to get the wood used to accepting another color over the top. And then I'll end up, once I get that initial wetting out, then I end up going with it a little heavier. Now you don't need to do that. That's just kind of my technique. That's just how I do it. To me, I feel that it helps to swell the wood fibers. And instead of just pounding a bunch of color in it, which can end up disturbing the black that's underneath, by laying that on a little softer, it tends to give a little better vibrancy to the secondary color, in this case the blue. So this is dried. This is basically the second coat. So I went a little heavier in the center, and I just kind of tried to, I went around the edges and then pulled it up in the center a little bit, and then tried to even it out, and got around the edges. Again, I'm not trying to go too heavy, too fast. And here I'm doing the end grain, which was sanded with the 400 grit, which can help to balance out the color a little bit. I could have probably even went with a 600 grit around the heavy end grains, just because with the end grains it's kind of like a straw and it will absorb more of the coloring. So the end grains are always going to end up being darker, so you can always go with a more fine grit to end up helping reduce such a dark color on the end grain. At this point, I'm pretty happy with the color, so I ended up grabbing the lacquer and just gave my light little misting, my dust coating. It's just a Minwax high gloss lacquer. At this point, that high gloss flash coat has already flashed off, so this was kind of my second coat, but my first real coat. There I just took the Keda die card and helped it dry off a little bit more. So this is kind of like my second coat, and you'll always want to keep your can, never want your can to turn upside down. I've had some strings come out on my sealers doing that, so try to always keep your cans upright. I guess that's a pretty good tip that I can pass along. It just ends up tending to spit, and here I was washing off the nozzle, kind of wiping it down, just to clean off the lacquer. So here's the secondary piece that I ended up doing because it just had a little more figuring and it was just a little more prevalent. As you can see, the colors are identical. I used the exact same formulas, the exact same technique. Everything was identical. It's just that that smaller piece had a little more figuring in it. Probably should have, just took a little more time to end up sorting through the pieces of wood that I was going to end up going through. But that bigger piece did look like it had a lot of good curls in it. So it can be kind of deceptive as well when you're just looking at it, and the difference between having the dye on it and just noticing it, looking at it in the raw. The smaller piece just had more figuring. It was a piece that I was experimenting on previously, so I kind of knew already that it had some really good figuring that ran all the way through, and it was just a B-side of another board. As you can see, it's basically the same exact thing, just on a different piece, and it just gives a little better representation of how the figure really pops with that black, and you just really draw out those curls and putting over the secondary color. It really just contrasts the overall finish, and I hope that that's a pretty good representation of that. I'm just adjusting the lights with the two pieces that are down to try to show what it would look like in a stationary position. Again, this is the product that I ended up using, the Keda Wood Dye kit. It has the 5 colors, the red, blue, black, brown, and yellow, where the only 2 colors I used out of that kit was the black and the blue for this particular video. This is the Minwax lacquer, high gloss lacquer that I just got at a home improvement store. I also did not do any wet sanding, and that's kind of what this little portion of the video is showing, that I did not do any wet sanding. I didn't polish it or buff it out. It's just basically the straight lacquer. I did the flash coat, the one heavier coat over the top of that, a secondary coat over that. I let that dry, and then I did a good between coat sanding, and then I applied my final coat over the top of that, where I didn't do a wet sand or polished out or anything. The blue is just really amazing here. The depth, the vibrancy really is not even being picked up quite as well as what it looks like in person. Here is the side view where the black is really kind of contrasting and highlighting the bands that wrap around the entire board there. But the black really contrasts that grain and really helps it jump out at you. It really does add another dimension of depth. Now you could do this with a dark blue mix as well. A lot of people just choose to do the black, and this is why. It really helps to contrast it. So I really hope that this was a helpful video, and that hopefully you pick something up fun out of this, and thank you for watching.